welcome to today's WIEF face-to-face on Reimaging Future Food Systems. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's welcome Darhim Hashim. He is the Group CEO of Radimax Group Sdn Bhd, Malaysia, and he is our moderator for this session. Over to you, Darhim.
Assalamu alaikum, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to our audience from all over the world. As you can see, this is my first webinar that I'm moderating. Previously, I've been privileged, I've been invited by the WIEF to moderate and speak at various physical conferences. So apologies in advance. I've already had one strike. I hope it's not 3 strikes, I'm out there. Okay, so I will hand it over to a real expert who will be speaking on today's topic. Specifically, if I may just introduce her first, Karen Smaller is the Director for Agriculture, Trade and Investment at a non-profit organization called the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which I believe is quite self-explanatory. And she will be talking specifically about programs, or at least an initiative to end hunger. You know, a very big ambition, but I believe she has a very pragmatic approach and also a sustainable approach to achieve such a lofty and utopian aim. So if I can hand over to Karen, who will speak, and then we will also have time for some questions and answers. So if you could post your questions onto the Q&A app, and then we will run through them. Okay? If I can hand over to you, Karen, please.
Thank you, Darren. And thank you to the World Islamic Economic Forum for inviting me to speak with you today and share with you my exciting news. So I want to share some exciting news about how we can re-image our future food systems. And I want to really focus on how we put hunger and ending hunger at the core of that re-imaging of food systems. So what am I going to share with you today? I'm going to share with you the work that I have been involved with for the last 3 years with a group of 84 other researchers from 23 different countries and 53 different organizations. And 3 years ago, this big group got together to answer 2 questions that would help accelerate progress towards ending world hunger by 2030. The re-imaging of future food systems that we sought to create was one that achieved 3 things: zero hunger, doubling the incomes of the poorest farmers around the world, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. We asked 2 research questions. The first question was this: what are the most effective ways to achieve zero hunger, double incomes of the poorest farmers, and protect the climate? And the second question was, what would it all cost? This re-imaging of food systems supports the United Nations 2030 agenda, and in particular, the Sustainable Development Goals. It's an ambition that brings me here today. And I think it's even more important today in light of the alarming rise in hunger as a result of COVID-19. Today, 1 in 10 people go to bed hungry every night. 1 in 10. Last year, 118 million more people were hungry compared to the previous year. That effectively has wiped out 15 years of progress in reducing hunger. So this work, I think, is even more relevant in light of this reality. This group of 84 researchers, we sat together and we read more than 100,000 papers to answer these 2 questions. We were also lucky to be guided by a board of 20 of the world's leading food and agriculture experts. And we partnered with the science journal Nature to publish our findings. In a very innovative way, we used artificial intelligence to scan 500,000 articles from the past 20 years of agricultural development literature. And then we integrated the findings from the research into a sophisticated economic model, a model which ran hundreds and thousands of equations to estimate the costs. So what did we do concretely? We collected information about agricultural interventions that work and that were successfully adopted by farmers in low and middle income countries. And we grouped our findings in 3 big buckets. So I want to help you visualize them. Okay, so our first bucket is interventions on the farm. These are interventions that directly help improve farmers' productivity and incomes. Our second bucket is food on the move. And these are investments to improve storage and the services that farmers need to move food to markets. And our third bucket is, we discovered that if we want any of this to work, any of the farm interventions, any of the move interventions to work, that we need to empower the excluded by ensuring every person's right to an education, a decent livelihood, and a political voice. These 3 buckets enabled us to see our solutions as a portfolio of interventions that constantly interact and reinforce each other. Let me give you a little bit more detail about our findings. So I'll start with our on the farm findings. And here we found that small-scale producers successfully adopt new technologies that are being developed, such as drought-resistant crops. But they must be accompanied by sufficient training and extension services, particularly for women. We also found that these crops have to be affordable, available, and profitable. So what we found is that there's plenty of technology out there, but there's not enough attention to context, nor to understanding how knowledge is best shared. We also know about the productivity gaps in agriculture. So I want to take the example of dairy in Africa, for example, where the cows produce up to 20 times less milk than the cows do in Europe. And what we found is that obvious and useful options to increase those milk yields are being overlooked and understudied. Simple things like using the residues left over after crops are harvested as feed for cows to help raise their milk production. Food on the move. So what we found was that donor investments in better storage for cereals and grains are working effectively to reduce losses after harvest. But other interventions are also needed. Things that will improve handling and packaging. And we need more investments in storage to reduce harvest losses for more nutritious foods like fruits and vegetables. There's also a need to look more closely at enterprises beyond the farm. So we confirmed the growing evidence that informal and small enterprises are successfully serving farmers across the global south, especially in Africa. These enterprises are powerful catalysts for encouraging technology adoption and improving incomes. They need to be brought into the policy debates. And our third big finding is about the millions of hardworking people who are excluded from progress, particularly women. We had an important wake-up call when we looked at all the findings together. No matter what intervention we chose, they were most effective for people who already had some basic access to capital. The reality is that the poorest are only marginally helped by these interventions. They only start to improve their lives and the lives of their families when they themselves have a place to start. And this takes capital in all its forms, not just financial capital. So we need social capital, like networks and being members of farmers' organizations. And we need human capital, like education and vocational training. We need knowledge capital, like investment in research and innovation. And of course, we need the financial capital, like access to credit and insurance. And whilst these are the different forms of capital that are a minimum requirement for success, they must be accessed and used in a way that protects the natural capital base so that future generations can also benefit. This minimum threshold matters because only when this minimum threshold is met do investments work to their full potential. So now the second question, what will it all cost? And while the researchers were synthesizing the evidence, we were simultaneously building a sophisticated economic model to find the answer to how much it will cost. And to show you this, I'm going to share my screen. So we found that it will cost an extra $33 billion per year from now until 2030 to end hunger, double incomes of the poorest farmers, and protect the climate. 19 billion out of the 33 must come from domestic resources. So that means from governments in low and middle income countries. The remaining amount, the 14 billion a year, has to come from external resources. And what we mean by external resources is either coming from donors through traditional aid mechanisms or from the rising pool of philanthropic activities. What this additional $14 billion per year represents is basically asking donors and asking philanthropists to double their current spending on food security and hunger programs. It's pretty underwhelming, right? Just doubling the current resources. That is how close we are. If we want to think about it in a per person in the industrialized world context, what we're talking about is an extra $11 per person living in the industrialized world. And for that tiny effort, we could bring a sustainable end to hunger within our reach. An extra $33 billion per year is enough to end hunger, double incomes, and keep greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture below the targets set in the Paris Climate Agreement. I want to spend a few minutes looking at where the additional money should be spent, and in particular, where the additional aid money or external resources is most needed. The countries who need most help to reach our targets. And here, what you will see in the map that I'm showing you is you will see that the countries in red are the ones who need the help the most, with darkest red needing the most help and the lighter colors needing less help. Probably unsurprising to many of you here, Africa is the continent where the greatest need is, and this has been strongly confirmed by the rising levels of hunger we've seen as a result of COVID, with a 50% rise in hunger levels in West Africa and a 33% rise in hunger levels in Southern Africa. 2/3 of this additional spending per year needs to be sent to Africa, and 2/3 of the additional spending needs to be spent on the farm. The current investments are working, but it's not enough, and they could be spent better. Importantly, the additional $33 billion per year of public spending would generate an extra $52 billion per year in private sector spending in agriculture and food sectors. So there's an important return of private sector investment that's triggered from this additional public spending. If donors and governments make this modest effort, the gains will be tremendous. It would remove almost 500 million people from the daily experience of hunger. It will double the incomes of 545 million small-scale producers and still maintain greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture below the targets set in the Paris Climate Agreement. If we could do this, we really create a truly just, equitable, and sustainable future food system. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. That was really well put. I see a lot of people selling stuff on the chat, but if I may just sort of do a quick summary, I'm sure everybody listened intently, but I like the flow, how you kind of split it into 3 parts. Really, one is to identify the problem. What are the problems that we're trying to solve, the objectives of this whole initiative? The how, what are the solutions, the three-fold approach, if you like. And sorry, this question there. And as well as, most importantly, the cost, the third part on the cost. Very well articulated, the fact that it's been quantified. And I like the overall theme. I'm a bit of a capitalist myself, so I have to really appreciate that this is not charity. I mean, people will talk about foundations and NGO, nonprofit. It's always in the context of charity, humanitarian aid, and so forth. This is investment. You know, you could even put a whole investment parameters about this with the traditional ROIs. Even private equity firms might be interested in this. Of course, they may have to adjust their hurdle rates and other expectations, but at the end of the day, we are talking about long-term returns, sustainable returns, and at the same time doing good for the world. So it ticks all the boxes for me. If I could just sort of scroll down we have more of a statement than a question here, but if I can also ask, well, I've got many questions, so until we get a whole sort of consensus of questions coming through, okay, if I could just start with, you're talking about empowering, and as we know, poor farmers are the most marginalized groups of society. You know, it's not like in Europe, where actually in France, for example, the farmers are the richest people, hence they have so much lobbying power. But in the South, it's the other way around. It's the urban who actually have a lot more political clout. So how would you, because essentially what we're trying to do here is to push through policies, trying to get domestic governments, as you said, to double up what they spend. How does one persuade national governments to up the game and to get more involved and put more skin in the game?
Yeah, important question. I mean, just to say, I love that you said this is not about charity. This is about real investments. This is about the real economy. And this is absolutely the spirit of this study and this message that we're trying to bring. This is not about charity. This is about creating more resilient societies where people can be productive economically and not depend on the government for aid. I would just make one, and so I think there is this sort of triple win that comes from this additional spending in these areas that you sort of alluded to. I would make one small qualification about the French farmers and the European farmers in general.
No offense to the French people out there.
We are not talking about the wealth. Farmers in any country are never the wealthiest. They may have disproportionate political power because of the way democracies have been set up, but they are never the wealthiest, and they are always depending on the public sector to support their livelihoods. Farming is a hard economic activity, and that's why most people, when they move out of hunger and poverty, move off the farm. So one of the key messages of this study is also not about keeping people on the farm. It's about improving the livelihoods and the income of people living off the farm so that they can actually choose something else. They can choose another career path. They can move off the farm and work along the value chains, or they can move into other sectors like services or industry. How to persuade national governments? I think there is a real issue. As you saw, our priority governments are those in Africa, and I think that's also a sign that the governments in Asia and Latin America have made huge progress in the last 30 years to remove their populations from hunger. More needs to be done around poverty, but at least from hunger. There is a capacity issue with so many national governments in that they do not have the finances to fund this additional investment. And that's why you'll see this, our countries in red are those that are still heavily dependent on external resources to just raise the public budget necessary to finance these projects. In Africa, what's been interesting is they set a target of allocating 10% of their national budgets to agriculture through the Malabo Declaration. So there has been targets set which are very, very good to make sure this additional money goes to the agriculture sector. But unfortunately, they've struggled to raise the additional money. So most of the African governments have not succeeded in meeting their own targets that they set themselves to allocate 10% of their budgets. How to persuade national governments? I think there's a catalytic effect that we have when we combine domestic resources, external resources, and the private sector. And I'm currently involved in an initiative as part of the United Nations Food Systems Summit to launch a private sector pledge where private sector companies would commit to align their investments. So not donate money, not charity, not part of their CSR, but align their core business investments in these three buckets, in these three areas where spending is needed. And I think that could play a catalytic role in persuading national governments to also step up to the plate and in getting donors to double what they're currently spending.
Yeah. I mean, I just interrupt there. I mean, I fully agree that actually the reality is that we do need to get the big boys involved, the MNCs. I know traditionally when it comes to activism, there's always this anti-big player attitude, but the reality is that they are there. They're supranational national companies. They're bigger than some countries, and they really do have the firepower to make things happen. So I think we have to work with them than against them, and that can have tremendous results. Okay. So,
one point on that is, and this is one of the things that our studies came out with, and one of the papers that was actually published in Nature was about the role of small and medium enterprises, SMEs, because we often underlook or overlook their role that these small and medium enterprises play. And yes, we all tend to go directly to the MNCs because they're all household names that we've heard before. But actually, there's a huge role, especially in the poorest countries, there's a huge role that can be played by the small and medium enterprises. And in this pledge initiative that we're launching at the UN Food Systems Summit, there's going to be a strong push to get SMEs to pledge and commit, because there's a huge untapped potential in those markets. Agree, the MNCs need to play a role as well, but there's a massive untapped potential in this huge pool of domestic private sector resources in a lot of the low and middle income countries that are the target of this study.
Okay, great. Okay, I've got a few questions coming up here on the Q&A chat. So we'll go from the top. It's quite democratic, actually. So whoever has the most likes gets their question answered. Ask first, sorry. So we have Amy at the top asking about food waste and making those countries that produce more food waste accountable in a way, to sort of divert that. I mean, we have this happens everywhere. This strange, I won't call it a dichotomy, but we have food waste in hotel buffets whilst people go starving in another part of the world. How do we address that misbalance?
So indeed, this is one of the big topics. Again, one of the 8 papers that we published was on this topic of food loss and waste. And indeed, this is one of the critical ways that we can do better. And I think what's really important to know is that both losses, food losses post-harvest, and the waste that we do at the consumer level, there are both huge wins to be made to improve those losses. What we found in our study was that there's been a lot of investment in storage facilities for grains and cereals at the harvest level. But there's less investment on working on the infrastructure and the storage facilities needed along the value chain, so further along towards the port or across the shipping, or when it reaches the place where it's going to be consumed. So there's a lot more investment needed to deal with storage and post-harvest losses and waste along the value chain. And then there's obviously the need to address our consumer habits, like our tendency to waste, our tendency to order more than we need, to buy more than we need. But there's a lot of really easy wins all along. And it's not to target one person and say the greedy people who eat too much at their buffet or who let the buffets go to waste. There's a lot that can be done. Just the fact that so much of Africa lacks basic electricity, basic infrastructure, so much food is being wasted post-harvest that could help feed so many people. So there's a lot that can be done locally in these countries if they get the additional investment and the money is spent better.
Yep, definitely so. Okay, we have a question from Asai Sayaka. I'll just read it verbatim. What is your idea to bring the social business approach to support poor farmers?
So I'm not sure I'm familiar with the social business approach.
Okay.
I don't understand the question so well.
All right, let me just maybe ask them to
Are we
clarify.
talking about like impact investors and?
I think, well, I don't want to answer on behalf of
Okay.
the person asking the question. Maybe if I could just ask them to clarify, please clarify. Okay. Set. Okay, so we'll just go to the next question. Okay, someone's jumped right up to 7 likes from Seat Wei Niam, reporter from Dhamma. I'll just read it verbatim, okay? We noticed that Malaysia is one of the countries that put under the on-target gray area. So quite a localized question. On the map that you showed just now.
Yeah.
So if 2/3 of the 33 billion should be focused on Africa, how much of it would be spent on the Malaysia and other on-target countries? So that's one part of the question. The second part is, and what do you think the Malaysian government should focus on food security issue? I mean, food security is already a policy in Malaysia, but in terms of area of focus.
So maybe I will show my screen one more time so we can get Malaysia on the map again, and people can see. But basically, thank you for the question. It's a really important one. The countries that are in grey in our model and in our exercise are on target to achieving zero hunger, improving incomes by 2030. So the message here is really important. It doesn't mean stop doing what you're doing in Malaysia. It means continue doing what you're doing. But if we're able to get additional money that money should not be targeted to Malaysia. That money should be targeted to the countries in red, in orange, and in light pink. That's what the message of this slide is. And it's really a message about the additional money and the external resources needed. So the message here, just to repeat it, Malaysia is on target with the current spending. So we're not saying stop doing anything in Malaysia, continue as usual. So none of the additional 33 billion a year should be spent in Malaysia. Now, what do I think the Malaysian government should focus on? I don't think I'm equipped to answer that question. I'm not an expert on the Malaysian food security policy and food security strategy. I can just say from our study, Malaysia is on track. Now, our study came out in October last year. It includes the projections for the rise in hunger that happened as a result of COVID during the first wave. But as we all know, we're now in our second and third waves. And if the situation gets much worse, we may need to revise our estimates based on what's happening as a result of COVID. So first wave of COVID, hunger is included. Second, third, fourth wave is not. So this is just a caveat on the messaging here and whether it still will be relevant if the situation deteriorates much further.
Thanks for that. Okay, we have maybe time for quite a few more questions perhaps. From Yusuf Ismail, okay, he's asking a question about the future of indoor farming. Is this a viable solution for meeting food demand, particularly in urban areas? Because we talked mostly about rural farming, so what's your view about urban farming?
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
Indoor farming. Yeah.
Absolutely. Indoor farming, I think, is one of the big areas for the future. We at IISD just published a paper looking at the future of food, and our analysis showed that we looked at 3 different types of technology that make indoor farming now possible, and the 3 types of technology were basically solar panels, ICT, information and communication technology, and computer chips. And basically what we found is not that these are new, because all these technologies have been around for more than a decade, but the increasing processing capacity of things like computer chips and the decreased cost of solar energy now makes the possibility of indoor farming and other types of agriculture, precision farming, robotic farming, all these very high-tech farming solutions a possibility. And it's not because of these technologies are new, it's because the price of using these technologies has declined so drastically in the last few years that it opens up the potential for decentralized, stable supplies of energy anywhere in the world that could basically be the engine for the future of farming. So I'm really in favor of exploring and continuing to pursue these indoor farming models. We know it's already happening in countries like Singapore, in Canada, in the US, but I think this reduction in cost of the key technologies needed for indoor farming is going to make it a possibility even in low and middle income countries.
Great. Okay, I have a long question here from Roslan Bakri, but I'll summarize it very quickly. Basically, how do you help communities which have very severe social problems? They talk about drugs, unwanted pregnancies, I mean, you just name it. And it's almost like a ghetto within the rural area. So they are not at 0, they're at -10. So we're not even able to, how are we able to even address the most basic of issues before we get to the stage of producing sustainable development?
I mean, I think this gets to our point about the empowering the excluded and the minimum level of access to capital. Like, this was really an important wake-up call for us because so many donors or aid agencies or companies are focused on the technical solution. Like, they want to roll out irrigation systems all over so that there's, there's more stable supply, that farmers don't have to depend on rain-fed agriculture. And it's true, we need the irrigation systems. better crops, climate resilient crops, drought resistant crops, and flood resistant crops. We absolutely need this technology. But without that minimum access to capital, nothing works. People don't benefit, and you end up with the kind of social and economic problems that you see Rosalind describing. So really the message here, and it's not financial capital alone, it's all these forms of capital. It's the social capital, it's the human capital, it's the knowledge capital. Without this minimum threshold, there's very little that can be done successfully.
Yeah. Okay. Just checking on time. I think we're still good. Okay, the next question is Ibrahim Patel. It's a very familiar name. If you are listening to me, I hope it's my friend from South Africa. Good to see a familiar name. So his question, I'll just read it verbatim. How do we overcome the dichotomy between increasing sustainable farming, as you propose, with the move to large-scale automation of farming? So there's a bit of a conflict there.
Yeah, and it's a challenging conflict. I would maybe start by saying I don't think large scale necessarily means unsustainable. Okay, it depends how we define sustainable, and I don't think that small scale necessarily means sustainable. We have a lot of small scale farming operations that are inefficient, polluting, unproductive, and all of that means you have to expend a lot more energy, use a lot more water in order to get a smaller amount of food. So for me, I would not call large scale unsustainable and small scale sustainable. That would be my starting point.
Right.
But there is a challenge on how we achieve these targets. And we intentionally in our project were not prescriptive about the pathway to getting to our target. So we didn't say that you needed to use agroecology and agroforestry or heavy input of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides and chemicals, because it really will depend on the context, how you get there. What I think was really important in our study was we constrained how many more emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, were allowed from the expansion of farming to feed people. And there is tension. So we had to constrain how much additional land was put under production. So this issue of keeping on deforesting and expanding land for crop production is not the best way to achieve our future and our current food needs. We have to be better. You know, all the discussion about sustainable intensification, how do we intensify and make the current land that we're using to grow food more productive and more efficient, is really going to be a much better pathway than trying to keep on expanding the land area under cultivation. So I think there's our land expansion issue that is critical, and that is, again, not pro or anti small or big. I think there's our energy source that we use, and that's why I think the potential for solar power and other renewables to provide farming communities with the energy supply that they need is also going to be critical. And here I think I'm very optimistic about the potential of some of the cost reductions that have come from a lot of the renewable sector.
That's right. I mean, when it makes financial sense, then it makes sense, and it's sustainable in terms of it's being self-financed.
Yep.
We have a question from Chandra Rem, who also sounds familiar. So, of course, it's inevitable that we have a question about in the context of COVID. So, what do you see how the COVID crisis will shape the future of the food system, especially the policy of countries around Asia?
Yeah. I think it's too early to tell. We all suspected when COVID first arrived that it would be short-lived and the rebound would therefore be quick, because COVID isn't about the economic fundamentals not working, it's about a pandemic. And so I think we all expected there to be a big shock like we saw last year, 118 million more people, that's a massive rise in the number of hungry people. So I think we thought it would be short-lived, and therefore we thought the rebound would be much stronger. But now we're seeing us all, and Asia in particular is experiencing a big wave, I think you're in your third wave right now.
Yeah.
And if this crisis goes on for another 3 or 4 years, we're talking about serious damage to progress that's been made in the last 30 years. I hope that the rebound will happen relatively quickly, because as I said, so long as we can get out of lockdown and go back to normal, the economic fundamentals were not the reason for this current crisis. The pandemic was the reason for this current crisis.
Mm.
But if we keep on going, we are going to go back to levels of hunger and poverty not seen for 50 years. And that is going to take us decades to recover from. I think it's too early to tell.
Yeah, it's true. Because I think each government has a different approach. It is a tough dilemma. If I wouldn't want to be a policymaker, having to choose between lives and livelihood.
I mean, the one thing that's been good is that the food stocks are very strong. So 10 years ago, we had a food price crisis that was linked to big food shortages. And that also took us back a long way. Today, food stocks are good, harvests have been good. We do have the drought in Brazil that's caused a bit of a hiccup in May, but in general, food stocks are good. The other thing that I suspect will happen is people are wanting their value chains to not just be coming from a single source. People don't want to only depend on a local value chain or only on a regional one or only on a global one. So I think we will be seeing a food system that's a lot more diversified, where we don't only rely on 1 or 2 sources to guarantee our food supply, but that we rely on multiple sources. So I think you'll see strengthening of local, national, regional, and global supply chains, because people are worried about potential disruptions that can come from things like pandemics.
Sure. Okay. I'll just carry on until someone tells me to stop. So we have a question from Tresford Chomba. This is in the context of Africa and providing seed capital, financial aid, not necessarily just through grants, but maybe perhaps through some guarantees, but just allowing farmers, small farmers in Africa to get started. Does the Series 2030 program address any of this?
So no, we're a research group, we're a research program. So we look at research and we provide solutions, but there are huge numbers of projects around. I would say probably the strongest mechanisms that exist today to help smallholder farmers in Africa are a mixture of IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the African Development Bank, the AFDB, and the GAFSP, which is a fund that exists out of the World Bank called the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, which also helps target smallholder farmers. So I think those are the 3 key financial institutions that I would say are partnering, and they all work with smallholders and SMEs. Right.
I think you've also answered the next question, which is talking about startups. How would you assist startups? It doesn't say which geography, but it looks like those institutions you mentioned are global. So it would definitely help with that. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, sorry. I think that was a clarification on the earlier about social business.
Our social businesses.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what was the question again? Sorry, remind me what the question was.
It sort of disappeared, but I think the question was about how could social business help address and achieve the similar objectives. So I think the context here is on Muhammad Yunus, what do you call it?
And microcredit.
Microcredit, that's right.
Yeah. So I do think it plays a role, but I think the kind of resources we need at the scale that we need, we can't rely on one source of business or finance. It's going to have to come from multiple sources and multiple different approaches. So whilst I think the microcredit, the microfinance, the social business is a hugely important tool, and I know that the sort of link to that, these big impact investors where you've got asset managers and funds who are not just looking for a bottom line of financial returns, but want to see other types of returns as well from their investments. I think all of this is going to have to play a role. But if you look at the numbers, they still only cover a tiny percentage of the need for credit, for finance. So I think it's going to have to come from a much broader source. And I think in particular, agriculture sector in low and middle income countries is not tapping financial markets, is not accessing those big financial markets where today most of the capital is circulating. So I think that's going to have to also be part of it.
Okay, so I think that question about startups has been addressed. Social business, okay. Back to Tresford Chomba, okay. Maybe you might want to contact them directly, talking about a partnership.
Yep, with pleasure.
My friend Ibrahim again, talking about with regards to Africa, how does the continent overcome the challenges of dumping? Okay, this is interesting. Since trade is under your portfolio, Karen, is a challenge.
Yes,
okay,
in Geneva,
so
where the World Trade Organization is.
That's right. So how do we overcome the challenges of dumping then by the usual suspects?
So this comes to an area that's also close to my heart, which is world trade and world trade rules. And for those who don't know, I'm actually based in Geneva, in Switzerland, where we have the World Trade Organization. So I think this global issue is something that has to be addressed through some kind of reform to global rules on trade. I don't think this is something that one country can do unilaterally or even a country can do regionally. So for me, this is really a global trade rule problem or a global trade rule issue. And Ibrahim, if you followed at all the WTO, you know that there's been a reform agenda that has been going on for, 18 years now? It was launched in 20 years. It was launched in Doha in 2001. So there is an agenda, and part of this agenda is trying to solve this issue of dumping. And I would say the two sort of key instruments are, one, reforming farm policy, farm subsidies. And there is a project at the WTO to try and reform the subsidy regimes of most countries. So I think that rule book needs updating. And there's also then an agenda to try and give countries a safeguard mechanism. They call it the special safeguard mechanism. And this would be a temporary measure that would allow countries to raise tariffs when cheap imports were flooding their markets. And again, this is a mechanism that Indonesia and the Philippines have been the leaders of this through the group of 33 developing countries at the WTO, trying to get this mechanism in place. And I think these two instruments, the reform of domestic subsidies and this special safeguard mechanism, if these two things were brought into the WTO rulebook or reformed in the WTO rulebook, I think that would make a big difference.
Great. Well, you're right there in Geneva, in the right place. Okay, I've been told we have time for one more question, so I will have a different. Oh, good. He's at the top anyway. Julian Hamilton Peach is asking about, is there a need for land aggregation in the red countries, as identified on your map, in order to achieve economies of scale to improve efficiency and protect the climate at the same time? And if so, where will the smallholders go? Does this displace them? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so it's too hard to talk in general terms about all countries. And even within a country, there's going to be some areas where small scale production systems are efficient, are productive, and should survive. So we see all over the world, we've seen both a mix of small scale production and large scale production and medium scale production working together and working efficiently. So I don't think there's a rule on land aggregation or land disaggregation. I think it really is country specific, context specific, strategy specific. What are the agricultural goods that you're trying to produce yourself versus import? So I don't think that is necessarily the key to improving the efficiency, or at least not as a blanket rule. And where will the smallholders go? I mean, this is a big question and it's very controversial, but Industrialized countries, you have around 5 or 6%, sometimes less, of the population involved in farming, and the rest of the population is involved in other economic sectors. In a lot of our countries in red, we have 50 or 60% of the population dependent on farming for their livelihoods. It is very hard to get everybody out of hunger and poverty when 60% of your population is depending on farming. So where will these farmers go? I think they should have the freedom to choose where they want to go. And that's why I think this access to capital is key, because that's what gives people choice. I think they should have the freedom to go, but basically they will be going, those who choose to will be going to other economic sectors that will hopefully improve their livelihoods, their revenue, and their opportunities.
Great. Yeah, I think there's no single solution for all. I mean, I like what you said earlier about having simple solutions, simple but effective. A lot of times what we see, people with good intention trying to apply first world solutions to third world problems. I think what is required is to be very sensitive to the local, not just the environment, but also the culture and the people, and to see what works. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is teach people to fish rather than giving them fish. And so just to sum up, I think sustainable, what we've learned today is that sustainable is not just about from the environmental point of view, but also from the financial point of view. And once you have these two acting together, in synergy, then the program does indeed become a sustainable program. Okay, any last parting words? That concludes our session today.
No, thank you. Thank you for all those questions. That was great. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of them.
As usual, the momentum builds up towards the end, and suddenly, if this was a physical conference, there'll be hands everywhere waving, and I have to tell people to sit down. So I'm glad I don't have to do that. I always hated being rude to people in the audience. Well, with that, I thank you very much, Karen. That was very, very insightful. We learned a lot today, and I think there will be some follow-up, which I'll allow the WIEF organizers to discuss that and explain some of the admin in terms of sharing of slides and so forth. But thank you very much for your input today and your time. And thank you from me as well. If I can just hand over to Ina, I think, or Siti.
Thanks for the great moderation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to our speaker, Karen Smaller, and moderator, Darhim Hashim, for being here today and making this webinar successful. Now, thank you to all. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's session. Now, we truly hope that you have gained valuable input and will be beneficial to you. Now, please spare some time to complete the survey form we've prepared for you at the end of the session. And also, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube for regular news and happenings. Now, on behalf of WIEF Foundation, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and have a great day ahead.